Hello everyone, I'm Randall Mendenhall alongside Brad Ross on location at the Range Systems Studio. Before we begin, hey, I've got some trivia for you. Check it out. Well, hello again everyone. I'm Randall Mendenhall alongside Brad Ross on location at the Range Systems Studio. I'd like to share with you our game plan for today. So the webinar should last about 40 minutes, give or take, depending on how many questions we receive. And speaking of questions, here's how that works. You can ask questions via the webinar interface, so you don't need to wait until the Q&A to ask. Simply click on the triangle next to the questions, and you'll open up a question text box. Once you've typed in your questions, go ahead and click on the paper airplane send button. Also, we have our slides available for handout. In order to receive those, just go ahead and click on the handout section, and then there's a link there to download the PDF. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to access it at a later date. And our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, August 17th, new versus existing building, which is better? That is a question that we receive a lot. So our featured speaker today is Brad Ross, Business Development Manager at Range Systems. Brad works with many of our commercial range customers and is the go-to guy for people in the early stages of planning and designing their range. Brad's topic today is, how much does a commercial shooting range cost? Brad, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Randall.
Okay, so we do get this question quite a bit, and especially for people in the early stages of the buying process, how much does a commercial shooting range cost? What kind of information do they need to know for that, Brad?
Well, thanks, Randall. This is obviously a question that comes early. It comes for a number of reasons from the customers. Some folks are just trying to get an idea of if this is a project that they can even begin to tackle, and others are pretty sure and have a decent idea of the process and what kind of investment, but they need the cost of this piece of their business plan. So it's a question we get with every call, usually within the first few minutes, and unfortunately it's a little bit more complicated than just throwing a retail price out for a range. So before we're able to give any kind of cost of a shooting range, we have to talk about where to spend the money. And there's a couple of different ways to evaluate where to spend the money, and one of those is how many dollars to spend versus the value that you're going to get out of it. And another is what is the cost versus the revenue generation that you're going to get from that. A couple of examples, and this will be a reoccurring discussion to talk about the distinction of these two phrases, as we go through the presentation. But a couple of examples are, dollars versus value. Are you looking for, spending additional monies on something that allows, a place for your members to hang out and stay and spend some time in the facility? Whereas, cost versus revenue, is it worthwhile to spend money on upgraded target retrieval systems, for example, because it's part of your revenue drivers to be able to justify that cost? So as we go through the process here, through the presentation, we'll hit these points a couple of different times to try to drive the points home of where to, or how to evaluate where to spend that money.
Well, those are good points, and building a shooting range, a commercial shooting range, is certainly not something to take lightly. What would be some of the reasons why a range would fail, Brad?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a nice spot to begin before we get into the range itself, because these are expenses that aren't brought up. In fact, research done from the SBA on postmortems of ranges, indoor ranges that have closed down, have really kind of found that there's three main reasons. We'll talk about a couple others here as well, but three main reasons why these indoor ranges have failed. And one of these reasons is people get into the business because it's a passion of theirs, and while that's not uncommon, it can be a bit dangerous if that person isn't focused on the business itself, but just trying to enjoy their hobby. Bringing in retail, for example, firearms that they really like, rather than focusing on what the customers are going to enjoy, things like that. So that's one of the big reasons, they get into it because of a passion, but because of their passion, they're not looking at it from a business sense. This is a place where they can go and be a part of the industry that they enjoy. So another one is, we talk about dollars spent and the cost of a range. The range itself is just a small portion of the overall project. Outside of the building and all the other improvements of the space and the land, you have to have additional money for marketing. Having the nicest range in the world is almost irrelevant if you can't reach the people to let them know about your great facility. So an important detail that new prospective range owners should keep in mind is you have to have a reserve. You have to have money set aside to drive people in there so your range can develop enough revenue to pay for itself and start turning a profit as quickly as possible. Another one is one that's a little bit difficult to talk about, but the NSSF surveyed a bunch of range owners, and 70% of the range owners that they surveyed either are or expect to be legally challenged. It's the whole "not in my backyard." These folks in the neighborhood surrounding, they may challenge the noise ordinances, and even if you're within the range that's allowed, they know that you have to fight that and that you have to spend money on litigation. So after that, they'll go after lead exposure, anything else that they can think of to tie you up, to push you out of business, to get you out of their area. So that's something that, with the range owners that invested all their money into the equipment, all their money into the retail, all the money into making this building as perfect as they envision, They forget about some of these things like marketing budget or unexpected details like litigation. I'll bring up another one that's a challenge is inventory management. Again, either too much inventory that's tying up your dollars or not enough to where you could potentially lose sales. So these are things that the savvy rangers, commercial range owners know. They're aware of it and they plan for it and do whatever they can to be able to not get bit by these things.
Well, that was a good message to pass across, and certainly something for everyone to be aware of. So back to our original question then, how much does a commercial shooting range cost? What could you compare this to, Brad?
Well, we can talk about it a couple of different ways, and at the end we'll give the cost of a basic shooting range. Obviously, there's different upgrade opportunities we'll get into, but when we're talking, back to that dollars versus value, that's a lot like buying a car. There's many options. There's different accessories, different level package levels. So when it comes to the dollars versus the value, again, different from cost versus revenue. The dollars versus value really has a lot to do with, very similar to buying a car.
Well, speaking of buying a car, this is one of my favorite slides today. You recently went through that process where you went out and purchased a vehicle yourself. What can you tell us about that process?
Well, yeah, so that's my vehicle. I wish I would have been able to clean it up before the big picture, but when I went out for the process, there was, like all of us have done, multiple times in most cases. I had to determine what are the options that I wanted to pay for. What did I value? And then, obviously there's options that they weren't that important to me, so it wasn't worth paying for. First and foremost, when I looked at the packages, a couple things stood out to me that I had to have, and that justified the cost. I have two teenage boys, and boy, one of them's over 6'2", the other one's closing in on 6'5". I needed a vehicle that when they were in there with me, there's enough room for them. So that large back seat was big for me. So automatically that put me into the 4 full-size door package, and I had to pay for that. A couple other examples. Up here in Minnesota, it gets cold. It's a newsflash, but it gets cold. We get snow, and so things like the remote start, the heated seats, which frankly was more for my wife than me, but a lot of value there. And then the WeatherTech floor liners, things like that. So those were things that were important to me, that I was willing to pay for, because the value I would get with those things, in the winter months, justified the cost. Where some things that weren't that important to me were maybe to others. I don't tow boats or trailers, so the largest engine or things like leather navigation, those things didn't hold a lot of value for me. So the package difference, of say $10,000 to get that, I can deal with cloth. I like the better gas mileage of the smaller engine, and frankly, my phone has navigation, so I didn't need the big screen. So, just again, dollars versus value. I look at this just like I think range owners should look at, their building and their business. There's a lot of bells and whistles out there, and if it doesn't have value to you, or as we talk down the road, if it's not helping drive revenue, then don't pay for it. Save that money, put it towards marketing, put it towards those potential litigation issues, so you don't get caught down the road.
Well, that's a good point. Each owner will value things differently, just like you did in your purchase process with your pickup there. What things affect how an owner would value something?
Well, obviously everyone's a little bit different, but you have to look at where their focus is. So when I'm talking to a prospect, we're determining, what are the revenue generation plans? Is it to sell firearms and rent lane time? Is it to really hit the retail side of things? Is it training? Are we going to look at from basic conceal and carry type training to advanced personal protection and law enforcement and that sort of thing? So revenue generation ideas, what that plan is, where the money is going to come from, those are extremely important. Again, when we talk about cost versus revenue, there are options that cater to these individual things. And then also, when you look at the type of the target customer base, are we looking at having a high-end, the executives, coming in to be members, or are we catering to, just call them the regular Joes here, but there's more of them out there. They're a different type of customer than the term that's out there now is that country club, that high-end customer. But it does change the type of equipment. This is something where if you're catering to the the regular Joes, they're not so much interested in, oh, I got to have this super fancy custom booth with neon lights and a cigar lounge and that sort of thing. It's not going to drive any additional revenues. They want a place to shoot. They don't want to wait. They want more lanes. Those are some of the things that person would care about. Where the higher end customer, they want to feel like they're walking into an exclusive club, and they'll pay higher memberships to get that feeling. So investing the money in custom booth and in a lounge area, and some of these other bells and whistles does help the revenue if you're able to drive a higher membership fee and that sort of thing. Cost of ownership and low maintenance. This is one that I think is often overlooked because of the excitement and the focus on getting the range open. But there are a number of folks that say, hey, I don't want to have something that I'm going to just be stuck maintaining and spending a bunch of dough, to handle that maintenance and cleaning and that sort of thing. So there are folks that, while it should be important to everyone, there are folks out there that's their main goal is I need something that's going to be efficient, both cost-wise and time-wise. And there is another segment. You know what? I want the lowest. All I want to do is open a range. Obviously, I want people to be safe, but I want to get this range open. Sometimes this is back to the potential pitfalls. A lot of times, this person here is that individual that this is a passion. They're tired of their 9-to-5. They want to get into the range and they want to do it as inexpensively as possible so they can make this their job. And there's products out there for those folks too. So these are just some of the different things that different owners value, and they're not exclusive. They can cross. They want the high-end customer, but they are doing a lot of training, and the low cost of ownership is important. So there's a lot of crossing of these areas, but these are some of the things that are different between various customers.
Well, I think it might be helpful to provide a couple of examples of why some owners upgrade certain items and some do not. What can you share about that?
Yeah, this, again, we're talking, with these examples, we're talking about that cost versus revenue. There's a top range operator. His business plan is he wants to keep people in the booth longer, shooting more ammunition. And based on fine-tuning and evaluating his business, part of his plan is to invest, and I use that word invest because it's an important part of this, is invest in that higher-end target retrieval systems that allow people to have courses of fire where they turn and they have lighting features and things like that, rather than just stand there, empty a couple magazines and move on. They stay there with longer rental times, and the thought there is that they're enjoying themselves more because it's different than what they're seeing at the range down the road. But that's a big part of this individual's business plan, and he's a very successful range operator, and has proven this with data. Whereas on the flip side, another range owner with multiple locations doesn't share the same value in this and is more focused on the revenue streams of selling guns and ammo and retail, and wants to get as many people through his store as possible, and that's where the revenue generation is. So this is a person that does not invest into the high-end retrieval systems because it's not part of the business plan, and again, top operator, multiple locations. This is what works for him. So it's not a one size fits all. So when we're speaking to the prospect, it's important to really get an understanding of not only what their vision is, but how they got to that point of the vision, to make sure that that the line of thinking is sound, and then we can move forward with speccing out the proper equipment.
Okay, so speaking of the right equipment, we've touched on this before, but it just bears repeating, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's an important thing, and often one of the more challenging parts of my job in speaking with people is they're excited about this. This is a venture. They've taken that first step to move forward and start educating themselves, and it's the land of opportunity, right? The business ownership. This is a big deal for them, and one of the toughest jobs we have as a range provider is to try to temper that a little bit, and often, when we get this question, how much does a shooting range cost, we have to back up a little bit. We really have to get an idea of what the proper equipment is, with the right options, to ensure that they maximize on their revenue generation ideas, to keep the cost down where it's not going to enhance the revenue generation, or where they don't have the value in it that would justify the difference in price. We really want to match the equipment to the vision, and again, similar to the new vehicle options, but we have a lot of folks that'll call, just kind of a not case study, but an example. A lot of customers will call, maybe they have a military background and they shot in shoot houses a lot, and they want a range, but they also want to add a shoot house. And when you're talking to them about that, again, it's that passion that wants that shoot house, where they haven't really thought out, okay, so you're going to run people through there, where a range you can have 10, 12 people on the line at the same time. They're all driving revenues for you. Well, in a shoot house, when you're moving through, you can't have like a ride at the amusement park, where you send the one roller coaster through, 30 seconds later you send the next one. It doesn't work that way. So it's very difficult to say, hey, how am I going to justify the cost of an extra, whatever the cost is for the shoot house, depending on the size. So we really want to talk through that with them, match the equipment to the vision, but make sure the vision is not blurred.
Well, that's a good point. Once the vision is solidified, it's not blurred, take us through what some of the common upgrades for a commercial shooting range actually are then.
Yeah, so this slide, it's we probably could have made it 10 10 pages long, but just to give you an idea for those of you listening who are really just starting out in this, to keep it simple. On the left-hand side, we have our standard range, basic range, whatever you call it. They're fixed position ranges, and what I mean by that is people stand at the firing line. They don't go down range. They stand behind there, and they move the target down range. Most of those, when we're talking basic, we're talking standard, they'll have a simple target retrieval system to carry the target. It's usually operated by a toggle switch. Some of the older ones, they're still around. They have a crank system, but for the most part, it's a toggle switch operation. Some of the systems have tracks. Others are just cable. They have just a basic bullet trap. We just want to shoot pistols. We don't need anything fancy. We're not going to allow rifle on the range. So the bullet trap is just a simple pistol-rated bullet trap. Maybe occasional rifle, but again, we're talking basic and standard. Lane dividers, just something to delineate the different lanes, and is going to protect the neighbors in case of an accidental discharge, and also allows you to have a shooting bench. And ventilation, obviously an important part of a range, and there's some other things like for the fixed position that speaks to the type of overhead protection and that sort of thing. But just from a high level, those are kind of the basic pieces of the range that have abilities to be upgraded based on cost versus revenue, and then even the price versus value. So when we talk fixed position, a way to upgrade that is to go to a tactical range. This is a range that on occasion, if your business plan speaks to that, and part of your revenue drivers are allowing some advanced training, people going down range, maybe local law enforcement, those kinds of things, that tactical range again changes the type of ballistic protection that we would put in, but it is an upgrade option that you can do on portions of the range or the entire range. Retrieval system, this is a big one that we have lots of conversations with. There's the toggle switch versus something that's got a touch screen and maybe offers some turning and lighting features, is programmable and has different courses of fire. These are options for systems that, again, if you have specific qualifying that needs to be done, where you have to be precise on the distance, a toggle switch operation is not the best way to go. If you need a certain course of fire, they don't offer that. So if your revenue sources, your drivers are for this advanced training or law enforcement or qualifying purposes, then it may justify the cost to really go up there. And there's in-between options as well, but just for examples, a lot of folks will want not only rifle-rated bullet traps, but part of their revenue drivers, especially in some of the areas like Orlando, Las Vegas, some of the tourist heavy areas, they want a bullet trap that has the capability of taking a 50 cal. They feel that's something they can market, and folks will have maybe never have the opportunity again to shoot a 50 caliber round. So this is a potential revenue driver and maybe justifies the upgrade. Lane dividers, we have standard, or we have some that are really nice looking, have some extra features. Some of them are customized with stonework and that sort of thing. And this could be this is more of a price versus value conversation. I want that high end. It's not providing any better protection, but I want that high end feel. I want people to just be blown away with the look and feel of the range. And ventilation, there's different types of ventilation, but depending on where you're at, do you want to add the cooling element? Now, this is and I guess why I put this one in here is this is an example of one that is both the dollars versus value and cost versus revenue, because everyone values nice temperature control, especially in the southern states where it can get brutally warm. So that's a value to everyone, employees and customers alike. But also, you have the opportunity with a comfortable area to have people that are going to spend more money, higher memberships, that sort of thing. So this is an interesting one because it really easily covers both of those two distinctions we talked about earlier.
Yes, and again with these options here, we made that example with our two successful range operators that we know personally. Again, one is using that toggle switch target retrieval system, and then the other one has determined with his business model and his revenue generation that upgraded target retrieval system. So two successful guys, two very different philosophies there.
And Randall, it's a good point. I'll give you a third one example. Another successful range operator who's just got a completely different take than the other two examples is a range that, boy, they have as small a footprint as you can imagine for as high a volume place as it is. Where some ranges, features outside the range, they want their restaurant, lounge area. They'll have simulation ranges, classrooms, a big retail. Top range operator in the western states has a range that's got a tiny footprint, almost no retail. I think you might have a soda machine or something, but we're not talking about restaurant. This approach is, I don't want to hire a whole bunch of people. I don't want to have all this space that hopefully somebody buys retail that I still have to manage. This is, I want to get as many people through here, shooting as many rounds as I can with as little hands-on as I need to do. And again, very successful. Maybe not all the same revenue drivers and not as much revenue as some of the other examples, but a lot less cost too. So, again, another example of that cost versus revenue. Bells and whistles didn't mean anything to this guy. It was how many people can I get through here and how many rounds are they going to shoot? So, each owner values things differently. There's a variety of options. So beating the drum here, it's important to thoroughly examine these things. What are your revenue generation plans, and what type of target customer are you looking at? And some of these things may have to change based on budgets that you're able to get, depending on where the monies are coming from, for the venture. And there's other needs, outside of what we've discussed here that that are unique to the individual. So these things, getting to understand these things and why it's so important to get the prospect to practice a little patience and answer some questions and talk through what their goals are. It's extremely important I know for me, I'll speak for me, to be able to match the proper equipment. Otherwise, without these questions, I'm just throwing my favorites out there, and that's not always what's best for the customer. So,
all right. So we've talked about the equipment and how it's important to manage the vision to match up with the equipment. Hey, what about installation?
Well, obviously it's a big portion. I bought something at IKEA once and brought it home, and it took me forever to install the thing or to put it together. Some folks out there are like me; they're not very mechanically inclined. So this is an important one because it's a large cost, but dollars versus value, for me, if I were building a range, I wouldn't have the capabilities I'd want the experts to install, but there are a lot of very handy folks with some great backgrounds. So when you're talking to range providers, you know, they differ on how they go about the process. There are some that they'll only sell equipment to somebody if they can install it. You know, whether it's, hey, I want to make sure it's done properly, or B, this is an additional source of revenue for me, so this is just kind of how we do it. There are some that will do it material only, and you know, still others who will, you know, have different options. That, you know, for example, at Range Systems, we give you 3 different options. We'll sell you the material only. If you have the crew and the wherewithal to install, you do get directions and a little bit of phone support. We can do a full installation, send our crew out there for as long as it takes to do a full turnkey installation of the equipment. Or we and we're not exclusive in this, but probably our most popular option is offering an on-site tech. This is a great way to save money for the customer that already has a crew doing the rest of the improvements there, or they can hire a local crew that they've worked with before or have been referred to. And so what a tech install does is they will we'll send somebody on site. They don't swing the hammer, but they tell your crew where to hit, you know, where to use it. So, and they provide the guidance there, and really go through each component of the range and kind of instruct how to install a section of each component. So a great way to potentially save money. You know, the costs are going to vary based on the equipment, what kind of access there is, and any other, you know, some other details. You know, but often when you're looking at a full installation, you're going to be looking at, you know, 25 to 30% of the total cost of the range is going to be the install. So it really is dependent on you know, what kind of resources you have available, and you know, that dollars versus value thing we talked about.
So we've got our vision down. We've next matched it with our revenue generation idea. We were able to use that information to help select our equipment. We didn't forget about ventilation and the importance of that. And then we are also factoring installation. How much does a commercial shooting range cost? All right, let's jump into it.
Well, you know, again, you know, the people just want a price here, and it's a little bit more difficult. But you know, again, I'll give you a basic idea here in just a moment. But you know, there is going to be a range, and it makes sense. Every shooting range owner has different, you know, these things we talked about. You know, different budgets, target customer base, and they all have different plans on where they're going to generate their revenue, as well as other, you know, other details unique to the individual. But let's go ahead and take a look at that basic range diagram again, and we're going to focus on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is upgrade potentials based on, you know, the values and the revenue drivers. So very difficult to give a range in that, because it could, you know, could go another 50%, 2-3 times the cost. But to get a starting point, when we're talking about the basic components of a range, a ventilation system, lane dividers and retrieval systems, a bullet trap, and you know, the overhead protection with the baffles and the safety ceiling. And you know, to illustrate that, this is just a sample drawing. You know, when we talk about a price, you know, we'll talk about it more of a, you know, what kind of a, you know, a 10-lane range. But for space purposes, here's 5 lanes. The top image is the elevation view, so from the side, and then down at the bottom is kind of a top view. So this is a you know, it's just a common drawing that we would send out to give somebody an idea of what they're going to be looking at. So, you know, on the top, you know, again, starting on the right-hand side, we have the bullet trap. In this case, you know, a granular rubber berm trap, a very common trap in the industry. And moving back to the left, those 40 or those angled pieces at the top of the towards the ceiling, those are the overhead baffle systems. And then they move into the safety ceiling, which is above the shooter. And then, of course, you know, you have your lane dividers and retrieval system. So back to the example, when we talk about fixed position, you see all those dotted lines. When we say fixed position, this is the person standing at the firing line, no matter where they shoot, either from straight ahead to down at the bottom of the bullet trap. All those dotted lines are potential trajectory points. The term that's used often is no blue sky. So a fixed range, we determine where those baffles have to go to ensure that rounds cannot leave the range. You can imagine, although I don't have a drawing here, you can imagine if you start stepping down range, those trajectory lines are all going to change, and there's a potential that rounds could escape and not be captured by the trap. So, and then the bottom picture is just an overview of the same thing. So back to that table again. You know, when we're talking about those options that we just looked at in ventilation package, you're going to be, based on about a 10-lane range, you're going to be looking at about $35,000 a lane, or about $350,000 for the basic package. And you know, obviously this doesn't include the building or improvements and that sort of thing, but this is a good starting point that folks can use to even determine if they want to put more effort into this. So, so the answer that everyone asked up front was, what does it cost? It's about $35,000 a lane is where we start.
All right, biggest takeaways of today before we jump into question and answer. What would you say we have for our biggest takeaways?
Well, biggest takeaways, Randall, I won't spend a lot of time on this because we hit it pretty hard throughout the presentation, but where are you going to spend your money? Don't spend money unless you're going to get value. Don't have additional costs unless you're going to be able to drive revenues to be able to pay for that. There's ways to have a range and save the money and still have a safe, clean, quiet range. If you're going to spend more than that $35 a lane, make sure you're going to get value, or it's going to help you drive revenue. I can't really hit it any more than that. You know, I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants a little deeper dive, but you know, I guess those are the biggest takeaways.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Brad. Well, now we're going to move into our question and answer part of the webinar. Thank you to those who have already submitted your questions, and if you haven't done that, you still have some time to do so. So let's jump in. Our first question is from Lori. Can you put $1 per lane on each upgrade?
Lori, it's a good question. Very difficult to do because there are so many options. For example, the retrieval systems, there are, you know, from the basic toggle switch, there are 3, 4, 5 different option upgrades. So difficult to do that. Would really have to speak with a range provider to discuss your individual goals and plan and revenue drivers to be able to answer that appropriately. You know, just from a basic standpoint, you know, if you're at, you know, say $3,000 a lane for a simple toggle switch operation, you're going to be double that for the next step up. And then really options that are going to go every $3,000 to $6,000 based on the option per lane. So it's a great question. It's just difficult to answer, and the retrieval system is only one example.
All right, we've got another good question here. If there is a plan to be able to move downrange, is a concrete roof better?
Well, it's a fantastic question. I think it's a matter of opinion and where you want to justify the cost. So, for example, I believe a concrete box, as much as you can get it, is the better way to go. It offers you flexibility. It ensures that rounds can't escape. It helps with sound and that sort of thing. So I believe it gives you the flexibility. It is going to be more upfront money on the building itself, and you don't need any additional overhead support structure, but it does really cut down the costs on the price of the range. So when we talk about, and I wish I had more time to get deeper in this for you, because it's a great question, is when you have that, now you don't need all that overhead protection, and we're going to click back to that. You don't need all those baffles, all that square footage of steel, and we put a ballistic rubber on. All you need is something much smaller, and they vary from range provider. Ours are what we call light guards, and it significantly cuts down the costs on the ballistic protection. So when we said $35,000 a lane for a basic range, when you have a concrete ceiling, that number goes down quite a bit more from there. So it's a preference on where you're spending the money, if you own the building versus leasing, that sort of thing. But I'm a proponent of the concrete ceiling if you want that flexibility of going downrange. So great question.
Well, Lori's got a follow-up question. Does the $35,000 include install?
No, it doesn't. When you're looking at a 10-lane range with all the equipment and ventilation, again, without knowing all the variables, 25% of that cost, on up to 30 if there's some access issues or things that we have to work around, 25% of that is going to be, added on top of there. So, the math there on 350,000, adding about 25%, will kind of get you a good install number. Whereas an on-site tech support, if you had local help, you're going to be looking at, depending on how many days we need, anywhere from $5,000 to $7,500 total.
All right, our next question is from Mike. What do you recommend for cameras and surveillance?
Great question. We get it a lot with regards to security, of course, and monitoring the shooters, but also with regards to some of the longer ranges to be able to view the targets, without having to grab a spotting scope. So biting that off in a couple of different ways. If it's for security issues, incorporate that in with your build. That would fall outside the scope, but speaking to ensuring everyone's following the range rules, I think if your business plan has, I think it's good to have for sure how much you put into it and what views you have of the shooters. I think is largely dependent on what your plan is as far as range safety officers. If you have a number of range safety officers that you already plan on having there, and a lot of training going on and constant monitoring with that regard, then you can step back some of the cost of that and maybe only do it for security purposes. If you would rather have less people, you want to automate things as much as possible, get a retrieval system with a lane management tool on it and have less range safety officers, then I think it's worth having multiple cameras with different angles and having one person monitor all of those. So just keep in mind, if you put a camera downrange to look back at the shooter, somebody's going to notice it at some point, and they're going to shoot it. They might try many times and not hit it, but eventually someone's going to shoot it. So when we talk about cost of ownership, if you're going to have one downrange looking back at the shooter, just be mindful that you may want some replacements on hand or some dollars set aside to do that replacement.
Next question is from Jay. What are the options for the sidewall berms if you want to make a 180-degree tactical range?
Great question, and this is going to sound like I'm doing a commercial for range systems, but you know, there's really the best option if you're intentionally wanting to engage, and Jay, we talk about if it's on the sidewalls with the trap, we talk about a 270-degree shooting area, and it's a common thing for us. We have a ballistic rubber that we manufacture. And for those folks who want to intentionally engage the walls, we would line the brick or poured concrete walls that you have with AR steel, and then we would adhere our ballistic rubber directly to that. So not only can you engage the walls, but you can do it at extremely close distances because the ballistic rubber is designed, and the combination of the ballistic rubber and the steel are designed to defeat the round completely and keep the shooter completely safe of any ricochet or splatter, and it contains all the lead dust and that sort of thing. So great question. How much or how little you do depends on the individual. A lot of folks will add maybe 15 to 20 foot starting at the toe of the trap, moving back towards the firing line. And some folks will do the whole wall. Keep in mind, if this is part of your business plan, back to the earlier question about advancing downrange, you have to consider that with that drawing again, that you have to add more baffle protection to prevent any rounds from escaping. You know, if you're down by the bullet trap, they can escape up through the baffles, so we have to overlap those, or as talked about before, go with that concrete lid. So those are just some additional considerations. But when you're looking at it from a cost versus revenue standpoint, this is a popular thing, and a conversation I have a lot is, if part of your business plan is you're going to drive revenues because you have a separate bay or time of the day or day of the week that you're going to allow downrange, on the move tactical training, people will pay more for it, and it could justify that cost pretty easily if you market it properly. Great question.
Next question is from Nicholas, and he's taking a different angle here. Would a rubber bullet trap be a better backstop for an outdoor range than a standard dirt berm?
I believe so. You have a couple of things working for you with regards to the rubber trap. Is first and foremost is the footprint. When you do a dirt berm trap, however high you want it, the base has to be 3 times that width. So if you want a 12-foot high berm, the bottom has to be 36 foot to be able to properly, maintain the berm. So that can take up a lot of real estate. So that's one aspect. The cleaning and maintenance of the trap versus a dirt berm is a pretty major undertaking when it comes to the dirt. It's heavy equipment. It creates a big mess. And where a rubber trap, they still have to come in and clean it. It's separated and put right back in the trap. I think it's a cleaner, easier, less expensive process. But I would say, aside from those two things, the biggest difference would be when you have dirt or sand or those kinds of things. There's no voids in there, so it's compact. So rounds don't go in very far. where the rubber granular has a lot of spaces in it, so it allows that round to go in and actually tumble to a stop and go a little bit deeper into the berm. So I also believe there's a little bit less. Let me backtrack. It's a little bit more important to be diligent on the cleaning if you have a dirt berm trap, because the rounds don't go in as far, and after it starts to fill up on the surface, you may have some ricochet potential there. So.
Well, thanks for the answer there, Brad. All right, we've got our next question from Mitch. For your full-blown tactical version, what would be a top-end estimate/budget figure?
Well, I kind of expected some of those questions and set myself up for it. Difficult to answer because not knowing the distance that we're talking about, but whether it's a concrete ceiling or not. But you would and what type of target retrieval system. So there are a lot of variables there. When we just talk about the overhead protection, forget about all the other, the per lane numbers and that sort of thing. The overhead protection itself, if you're looking at that drawing and they have on a fixed lane for a 25-yard range, there's the safety ceiling, and then there's 7 rows of baffles with our setup. You now go to 22 rows of baffles. So just the overhead protection itself goes up by a multiple of 3+. If you were to say, hey, my whole business plan is based on advanced training and downrange and law enforcement and that sort of thing, it would not be out of the realm to say you're going to be looking closer to that 60. 50 to 70, depending on some variables per lane basis.
All right, Lori's got another question for us. Does it include the ventilation? And I'm going to make the assumption that Lori is referring to our next slide, the 35,000. Lori, we're going to assume that you're talking about the standard, and does it include the ventilation?
Now, Lori, yeah, to answer the question, yes, it does. But full disclosure, when it comes to the ventilation, we leave that to the experts. We partner up with some of the top range ventilation companies out there, and actually put you in touch with them. But just with an idea of what their pricing is for the base option, the basic option, the 35,000 a lane does include what they're talking about, or what their price is roughly for ventilation. Depends on the company. It depends on the width of the range. The width of a range affects costs all the way up from the ballistic equipment to the ventilation. So if you're from 10 lanes at 36 foot versus 10 lanes at 40 foot, there's a pretty decent price difference there. That's another reason why it's always very difficult to get the per lane price, because there's just so many variables. But yes, 35,000 would get you a ventilation as well.
Hey, I like your point about the width of the range. In last month's webinar, you touched on that, about how that is a really big influence in the overall cost, that width of the ranges. Okay, Mitch asks another question. What about the cost of indoor trap and skeet?
It's a good question. It's one we're starting to see more and more requests for. Mitch, I'm going to bail out on this one a little bit, because to do something like that with our equipment, it's just way overkill. There are other products out there that are specialized to be able to be anti-deflection, that utilize different plexiglasses and netting. It's not in our wheelhouse right now. The couple of folks I'm working with that have that as part of their business plan, and I actually wish I could recall the range. I've seen the pictures where they have a pretty successful setup. They end up going outside of our scope for that. So unfortunately, we could price it out for you, but the equipment that we would put in there, that we put in most of our ranges, to be anti, ricochet and capture the rounds, it would just be overkill for that type of shooting. But there are a couple out there who have done it very successfully, and unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the range right now.
All right, our last question is from Jay, and Jay asks, what are the different options for the trap, and what are the pros and cons, especially the maintenance aspect?
Jay's got, I'm assuming it's the same Jay, a couple of great questions. There are, many different designs depending on who you speak with, as far as range providers. For us, we have three different. We have the rubber berm, which we saw. We have a steel ramp trap, and we have a ballistic rubber block trap. For the most part, for commercial, for the most part, there are exceptions. I rarely recommend the block trap because one of the important things is cost of ownership and maintenance, and with a high volume commercial range, the block trap just requires more maintenance. Now, if it's a small space, sometimes that's the only trap that really works because the footprint is so small, being less than 18 inches. So if you have a very small space and want to maintain a longer shooting distance, then sometimes that is the trade-off is, hey, I want to make this work. I'm willing to put more maintenance into it, but we're pretty upfront about that. When it comes to the age-old question, steel versus rubber, I would suspect, Jay, if you were to call a couple range providers, they're going to come at this with a different approach. So my response is take it for what it's worth. It's one man's opinion. Frankly, there is rarely a situation, and our steel trap is fantastic. And frankly, it's a heck of a lot more money, so it should be something we probably pitch, but we just don't work that way. There's very rarely a situation where I recommend a steel trap over a rubber berm trap for a commercial customer, and the reason is this: simply upfront cost. I don't see the benefit. I don't see how the revenue generation is going to be any better to justify the cost that could be, depending on options, 4, 5, and 6 times more money than a rubber berm trap. It's very difficult when you take that 10-lane range and now all of a sudden you're instead of $35,000 for the whole bullet trap, now you're going up to $250,000 to $350,000 for the bullet trap. It's a very difficult cost justification for me, because I don't feel it adds the value. As far as the maintenance of it, with the steel trap, if you do the bucket, brigade system and empty the bucket out into a bigger bucket, sure, you can have a little bit of revenue there. You still got to hire somebody to do it, or do it yourself, which is still a cost. But aside from the cost and footprint, steel traps just take a much bigger area, and space is money. Aside from that, when you're talking about the cleaning, there's companies that do it. They'll do it. They'll do it overnight. If you have multiple bays, you don't even have to have downtime. You do it once a year. And if you're super high volume, maybe you do it twice a year. But if you're that high a volume, it's not going to hurt your feelings, because it becomes a revenue source because of all the lead that's in there. But I look at an approach that we have, and again, this is a range systems approach, and there's other approaches out there, but our goal is safe, clean, and quiet. We provide ballistic rubber. We don't like to redirect. We like to capture rounds. We don't like to create extra air dust, which goes to cost of ownership. That ventilation is an expensive portion of the range. It's an important portion of the range, and those HEPA filters are not that inexpensive, and when you have to change them, which is typically 4 to 5 times more often on a yearly basis with a steel trap, When you have to continue to do that, not only do you have the upfront cost, but you also have the maintenance costs, and sound. Steel trap, you intentionally have a violent collision between a round and a hard object, and it breaks apart and creates lead dust and sound. The rubber trap, the rounds go in, they tumble to a stop, and they don't break apart, and it doesn't create all the lead dust, and of course is quieter. I would even feel stronger about it if your approach, and you know, again, Jay, if it's the same question about the tactical, I certainly wouldn't want to be advancing down range doing cross lane tactical shooting up close to the trap if it was a steel trap. Sometimes based on your individual business plan, you almost take that trap out of play immediately. But again, that's an approach that we have. So.
All right. Next question then. This is from Harrison, and Harrison says, do you have any info on the cost of rehabbing or upgrading a failed range as opposed to just designing and building from scratch?
Boy, there's some great questions coming in, Randall. I think we've got another 3 or 4 or 5 different upcoming webinar features. It's a good question, Harrison. It's one we get quite a bit because there are a lot of older ranges or ranges which maybe they're not that old, but they weren't run very well. You know, going back to our earlier, you know, why some ranges fail, but we get the call quite a bit. You know, we talked to, the question came in about the different traps. You know, a lot of ranges are very, you know, they're old and they're only 50 foot, and the bullet traps back then, they used a angled piece of steel that deflected into a sand trap, and you know, there's just not enough space to put in some of these, you know, the granular trap or certainly the steel trap. So we do have a trap that accommodates that. The biggest challenge we have there is removal and disposal of the current stuff, and that would be something that these range cleaning companies would have. They're out there. There's a number of them. I could certainly give you some referrals. Once there is that space, that clean space, then absolutely upgrades, retrofits, that sort of thing. Most of the equipment that we have, and probably likely other range providers, are designed to fit within the space that you already have. So,
okay, it looks like this is our last question here, and this is Lori asking, do you and how much do you charge to help with the development of a range?
As far as the development, are we talking about, you know, Lori, maybe if you got quick typing skills, you can clarify, are we talking about business plan, or are we talking about just the layout design? I'm unclear as to how to answer. If it's about the business plan.
Yeah, and Lori responds, just layout and design.
Oh, absolutely. With the space, then, and through conversation, we get an idea of you know, what the best fit for your space and your goals are. Then we do lay it out, and we do the drawings for it, and you know, make it fit to the space that you have. If you need some suggestions on the space itself, where it's a big building and you need to divide it up into the area that's going to be, you know, the box that's going to be the range, you know, we can certainly help out with that too. Some folks work with architects, and we work directly with them on you know, if it's a new build, we work directly with them and guide them on the space that's required, and so we can help out in any number of ways with designing the space.
Well, it looks like that's all we have for questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question. We had some really good ones today. And Brad, thank you for presenting on how much does a commercial shooting range cost. Our slides will be available for download as I have up on the screen, and our recording will be available later. I've got Brad's contact information if you want to reach out and follow up with him. And lastly, our next webinar is Thursday, August 17th. We're going to go with new versus existing building. Which is better? Looking forward to having a good show there. So thanks again for everybody who joined us today, and have a good day.